Hello, First Baptist Greensboro. This is the third week of our study of the book of Acts together. This week we take on a really scary story, the story of Ananias and Sapphira, their deception of the church and the spirit, and the deadly consequences of what they did. This is one of those stories that we should read and it should have us come up short and wonder, why in the world is this story in the Bible? And what in the world is it trying to teach us? To try to explain this week, I think this is a story about the high stakes of community. That when we gather and how we gather together, how we worship together, how we fellowship together, how we do the life of the church together is not of secondary import to God or to one another. That what we hold in community is a valuable thing, an important thing, but also a deeply fragile concern as well. In these weeks after the election, and as we see the pandemic numbers continue to rise, I think it's a good reminder of the obligations that we have one to another as neighbors, of the high stakes of community, that how we imagine our neighbor, how we gather, how we treat one another, goes beyond just interpersonal relationships to a much bigger dynamic. And fundamentally, how we gather together reflects what we think about God as well. It's a powerful reflection of our own theologies, and thus important for our consideration in these really divided, really difficult days. Thanks, friends. Hello, friends. Welcome to our third week exploring the imaginations in the book of Acts. How the stories, these vibrant, beautiful stories in the book of Acts, help inspire all kinds of imaginations for us. Imaginations for a flourishing world. Imaginations where, in a world of complexity, in a world where we're facing all sorts of unexpected challenges, I think the book of Acts can walk alongside us and help us see the world a little bit differently. Help us imagine ourselves as children of God just a little bit differently. Last week, our imagination was about that text in Pentecost, an imagination that suggested that our differences are gifts that God has given us, not curses that we need to overcome, not challenges that we need to get around, but the very place where God is most living and active today. Our imaginations this week take us to the end of Acts chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5. They take us to stories that imagine this community coming together in generous ways, in ways that I think there's a part of us that desperately yearns to imitate, yearns to see in our midst, but in ways that we find impossible, in ways that we can't imagine ever quite working out. In the early chapters of the book of Acts, Luke, at least twice, narrates that this community sells their possessions so that there's not a needy person among them. And the question is, what do these texts have to do with us today? Are they calling us to sell what we have, sell all our possessions, give it to the church so that the church can take care of all of us? Or might there be a different imagination in play in these stories? So the imagination I want to suggest for us this week is that community is a matter of life and death. That community is a matter of life and death. To start off, let's look at Acts chapter 4, starting in verse 32. It reads, "Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold." This is the second of these narrations Luke has of this early community coming together, selling their possessions, and creating this utopian reality. I love this line that there is not a needy person among them. And when I hear that story, that's exactly the kind of community I want to be a part of, the kind of community I yearn for. One where people's basic needs are not just met, but exceeded. So Luke gives us this picture of this community, and I think there's a couple pieces of this picture that I think are worth deconstructing and thinking a bit more about. Number one, I think, is for us to notice a couple of things happening here. One is, we look at verse 32, the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul. There's this fundamental unity drawing together this community. It's not imposed, it's not from the top down, it's from the ground up. It's this sense of unity, of cohesion, of caring and loving for one another that's at the root of this community. But I think we have to go one more step beyond that to learn, why is it that this community has gathered together in this way? What is it that propels them to sell their possessions, to give what they have, so that there's not a needy person among them? What is driving them to this moment? And I think here we miss something really important in this text, or at least I often miss something really important in this text. Notice, and here we can see in this slide, the parts in gray, that's verse 32 and verse 34. And I know when I'm thinking about this text, I often will jump from verse 32 to verse 34. I will jump from, but everything they owned was held in common, the end of verse 32 there at the top, to the beginning of verse 34 at the bottom, there was not a needy person among them. And I assume that that means that there's not a needy person among them because they sold their possessions and gave them to the church. But reading it that way means that I'm skipping over verse 33. So let's go back and take a look at that. And that's now in the bold print. Verse 33 says that with great power the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. That is, the reason that they sold their possessions, the reason there was not a needy person among them, is not because they were so awesome or generous or faithful or smart. It was because they believed in the power of the resurrection, because the power of the resurrection energized their work. It gave their work shape and meaning. The community came together, not because they were such good Christians, because they believed in the power of the resurrection, and the power of the resurrection was with them to create a community where there was not a needy person among them. It makes me wonder how that power of belief might be embodied among us. And that belief here is not just believing it in your head, but the kind of embodied relational way that we hold our beliefs and we let those beliefs shape us and shape the world that we see. If God can raise the dead into life, then how much more can that God be trusted to provide all that we need? That fundamental trust in God's power in the resurrection should shape the way that we move through the world. And not in any kind of cavalier way to say that, that because of God's resurrection power, I'm immortal, so I can do whatever I want. But a deep belief in the resurrection that leads us into a deep and profound love for our neighbors and a deep and profound care for our neighbors. Luke goes on in the story to say they laid it at the apostles' feet, that is the proceeds of what was sold, and it was distributed to each as any had need. And then an example is lifted up. There was a Levite, a native of Cyprus, Joseph, to whom the apostles gave the name Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. He sold a field that belonged to him, then brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. And thus closes chapter 4 with an example of this kind of faithfulness, an example of Barnabas, who comes and sells his possessions in such a way that even his name reflects his faithfulness to this community. He is a son of encouragement. And if that were the end of the story, if that was all that we knew about this community, then I think we might be left in a pinch wondering, what does this mean for us? Does this mean that this is a model for every community, that this is a blueprint for how we should all live our lives? Of course, there's a lot of reasons why you and I, why we might hesitate to sell all our possessions, give them to the church, and thus form a community where all our needs are met. Number one, if I'm honest, sometimes we're all kind of greedy, right? I think we often like to hold on to what we have, to protect what we have and get more of stuff, thinking that stuff can protect us from the dangers of this world. Sometimes I'm not particularly trusting of my neighbors. I don't always trust those around me. I think that only I can take care of myself. Only we can take care of us. If we don't take care of ourselves, then nobody else will. So there are often reasons rooted in fear and distrust that might keep us from selling our possessions and giving them to the church. But there might also be lots of really good reasons why we may not want to do this. A lot of us have obligations to people, to children, perhaps to a parent that we're now taking care of. We have obligations to people that our possessions, our stuff, help us meet the needs that these people have in our lives. And that our children and maybe our grown parents, or think about parents with children with disabilities, like we have this deep commitments to other people, these deep obligations to other people that we have to take care of. But not only that, there might be another good reason why we may hesitate to sell our possessions and give them to the church, is that for a lot of us, for many of us, the church has sometimes not shown itself to be worthy of such deep trust. That we know about communities, we've been part of communities, we've been hurt by communities, where the kind of trust that this would involve is just not present. Where sometimes people we've trusted have taken advantage of our trust. There's lots of bad reasons, lots of negative reasons why we may not see ourselves selling our possessions to the church, but I think there's a whole set of good reasons as well. If we read this text about this utopian moment in the early church, and all we feel is guilt that we can't do the same thing in our own communities, then I think we're missing something rather important in this text. Because, my friends, the gospel is not in the business of just making us feel guilty about the things we have done or the things we have left undone. The gospel is also a promise to us, a promise about God's grace, a promise about God's presence. And if we just get stuck in the guilt, then we miss something really important happening in this text. One thing that's happening is a problem with the text here, is that the chapters and the verse divisions, all those numbers in our Bibles, were added later on. So Luke isn't writing along, adding chapter 5 and verse 1. These things are added later on. And there are moments when these chapter divisions and verse divisions are not placed in ways that I particularly appreciate. And this is one case of those. So at the end of chapter 4 is a story about this utopian community holding all things in common. But then notice what happens at the beginning of chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 1, the first word there is but. But a man named Ananias. The but that begins chapter 5 is so significant for how we read what happens at the end of chapter 4. But a man named Ananias. And proceeds, we'll read it here in a second, is the story of Ananias and Sapphira lying to the community and breaking the community apart. As soon as the community starts coming together, it also starts coming apart. As soon as the community has this unified sense of its purpose and its unified sense of taking care of one another, it also starts fraying at the edges. But a man named Ananias. It's not enough to read the story about what happened, the utopian things that happened in this community, the good things that happened in this community. Remember, Acts is also giving us a picture of the church in all its fullness. Not just its great moments, but its moments of failure as well. So let's keep reading what happens at the beginning of chapter 5. But a man named Ananias, with the consent of his wife Sapphira, sold a piece of property. With his wife's knowledge, he kept back some of the proceeds and brought only a part and laid it at the apostles' feet. So here, and again, this is another reason that division between chapter 4 and chapter 5 is problematic, is that you have Barnabas at the end of chapter 4, this example of faithful giving, and then at the beginning of chapter 5, it's a mirror opposite in the form of Ananias. It goes on, Ananias, Peter asked, why has Satan filled your heart to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep back part of the proceeds of the land? While it remained unsold, did it not remain your own? And after it was sold, were not the proceeds at your disposal? How is it that you have contrived this deed in your heart? You did not lie to us, but to God. If you remember, Peter has a similar conversation with Jesus in the Gospel of Luke. Luke's Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." This sense that Satan has involved himself in this person, in this narrative. So you can almost hear a memory of Peter's own experiences coming through here. The act that Ananias takes isn't just an act of greed, an act of deception, but a demonic act at its very core. There's something so astray here. And notice also that what Peter says is that you didn't lie to us, you lied to God. That the lie that you brought, the way that you have framed this community, is an offense not to me, not to this community, but to God, God's self. Now when Ananias heard these words, he fell down and died, and great fear seized all who heard of it. The young men came and wrapped up his body, then carried him out and buried him. I feel like that line, "and great fear seized all who heard it," is maybe underplaying it some. If we're reading the story or we're not a little bit afraid, if we're not shaking in our boots, then I'm not sure we're paying attention. This is a scary story. It's a weird story. It's a story that makes me wonder, what in the world can we do with this? How can this story speak to us in this moment? I can imagine that you could preach 1,000 terrible stewardship sermons with this text. If you don't get to the church, look what God did to Ananias. And again, that misses, I think, the whole heart of the gospel and the point of this story. Again, remember our imagination here is that community is a matter of life and death. That what these stories about, the imaginations that they're stirring for us, is what is at stake in community. And also about the fragility of community. But let's go on in the story. We'll come back to this. In a very kind of artistic way, Luke mirrors a story. So Barnabas and Ananias are mirrors to one another, and then Ananias and Sapphira are mirrors to one another. After an interval of about 3 hours, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter said to her, "Tell me whether you and your husband sold the land for such and such a price." And she said, "Yes, that was the price." A little detail to notice here, it's not clear what price Peter said when he said such and such a price. Did Peter say, did you really sell it for $1,000, let's say, when $1,000 was the fake price that Ananias said they sold it for? Or did Peter, the price that Peter named, was it the real price that the land was sold for? Say it was $2,000. Did you really sell it for $2,000? So when Sapphira says, yes, that was the price, is she caught in a lie? Is she confirming the lie that her husband told, right? And she says, oh, yeah, it was $1,000. Or is she confessing that Ananias and her had conspired to lie to this community, and she's confessing it and says, yeah, that was the real price. The story doesn't make clear which one it is, but regardless, the result is the same. Then Peter said to her, "How is it that you have agreed it together to put the Spirit of the Lord to the test? Look, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out." Immediately she fell down at his feet and died. When the young man came in, they found her dead, so they carried her out and buried her beside her husband. And great fear seized the whole church and all who heard these things. And again, I think the great fear might undersell how we should react to this story. It's a scary story. It's a frightening story. I'm not sure I'm ready to follow a God who will strike people dead in this random way. But what if something else is happening in the story? What if this isn't a picture of God's judgment? What if this is not some command on us to sell all our possessions and otherwise God is going to strike us down dead? What if something else is happening here? What if what's given to us here is a picture of community? Again, that community is a matter of life and death. What if there are two parts of this community, a picture of this community that are drawn here for us? Number one, is that community is so vitally important. That the ways that we gather together, the ways that we treat one another, the ways that we are community in our churches is not just a matter of whether we're polite or not, or nice or not. It's not a matter of how nice the community is, but that when we gather together, we are holding our neighbors' lives in our hands. That the stakes of our gathering, the stakes of our belonging, are our lives being held in each other's hands. That how we gather matters so deeply to God, because how we gather is a reflection of God's character. It's a reflection of God's resurrection power. So what if, number one, there's so much at stake in how we gather together, and maybe in previous times, we have not taken community seriously enough. And number two, another picture of this community, perhaps, is that Acts here is reminding us about the deep fragility of our community, how frail our communities can be, how one little lie can rip apart this thing that God is trying to stitch together. The communities, there's a lot at stake in these communities, and that they're incredibly frail, and that that we've been called then to tend to these communities, to care for them, because it's a matter of life and death, and these communities are so incredibly frail. If we use the story of the community gathering together and selling their possessions, or this community of Ananias and Sapphira to just beat each other over the heads about how terrible we are, I think we miss the point of this story. Instead, what I think Acts is giving us is this intimate, kind of scary picture of the stakes of community, of what it means when we hold each other's lives in our hands. It's calling us to something important. That when we gather together, we must treat each other with a tenderness, with a gentleness that befits the kind of tenderness and gentleness that God has already shown to us. What if community is not just something we do? What if community is not just a nice thing to have? What if community is a matter of life and death? And what if that community doesn't just happen in our church buildings, but in our schools and in our work, in our neighborhoods? What if the ways that we gather matter so much to God that it's a matter of life? It's a matter of death. It's a matter of belonging. It's a matter of knowing the shape of God's grace today. As we close, just a few questions that you might share with some friends, some folks at a Zoom call, or maybe somebody in a Bible study group. Here are those questions. Number one, what is the value of community in your life? In what ways have communities been a matter of life and death for you? Number two, what are our obligations to one another in light of God resurrecting Jesus? That is, if God brought Jesus back from the dead, what difference does that make for your everyday life, your everyday existence? And number three, in the future, and here I'm thinking in particular, a future beyond this particular moment of pandemic, of social isolation, of social distancing, physical distancing. In the future, whatever the future looks like after all this, how might new imaginations about community shape how you gather with neighbors? How might you imagine yourself living into a new imagination about community after we're able to gather together once again in a safe way? In short, what might it look like for us to take seriously that the ways that we gather are a matter of life and a matter of death? Thank you so much, friends, for your time. We will see you next week.